everyone. I'm Tracy Dowdy, the field crop entomologist with OMAFRA. This is session 22, all about the tea-resistant corn rootworm in Ontario. We have three very good speakers today to discuss this issue. First, we'll have Dr. Jocelyn Smith, a research scientist in field crop entomology at the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus. She specializes in insect resistance management for transgenic corn. Her research activities include collaboration with commodity organizations, seed and pesticide industries, public researchers, and government specialists to develop management strategies for the key pests in corn, soybeans, and wheat. After Jocelyn, it will be Christine O'Reilly, the forage and grazing specialist in OMAFRA. Her area of focus includes the benefits of
of your screen. Make sure that your name on Zoom is real so we can do a proper attendance for points. Or if it just says something like Alana's iPhone, you can direct message me on the chat and let us know what your first and last name is. You'll need to be present for the whole session to receive points. And the barcode for the CCA credits will be available at the end of the session. Your points receipts will be emailed out to you within 2 weeks, so please keep these on your file for your license renewal process. And these sessions will be recorded and sent out at a later date for your reference. So first up, we're going to have Catharine, and Catharine is the merchandising manager with Sollio Agriculture. We're happy to have her here today to speak to you on marketing. So Catharine, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen.
All right, let's see how this goes, everybody. Did we pop up, Alana?
Yep, I can see it, Catharine.
Okay, perfect. So hello, everybody. A little bit different way of doing a presentation, but I'm happy to do my part. Thank you for everyone at Truro Agromart for inviting me to speak today. There's been a lot of changes in the grain marketing world over the past year. I had mentioned to Alana earlier, we are having a storm here. So for the presentation, I'll turn off the video mode because it does delay things. Just trying to keep the technology flowing without too many freezes and pauses. I am by no means an expert at the technology side, so bear with me if we do run into some problems. So I've left for the end of the presentation for any questions and answers period. I'm going to go through what's happening in the global grain market, how it's affecting your local grain market. And then at the end, I've put together a package to show you what our online bid portal looks like. There's been a lot of questions about that, and it's actually something that we are transitioning everybody to in 2021. So with that, we will get started. Second. Okay, there we go. All right, so the grain marketing recap for 2020 and 2021. We've seen a lot of changes. First of all, I'd like to just refresh everybody, and maybe for some of you who aren't familiar with the local Atlantic team. Myself, I'm the grain merchandising manager for Atlantic Canada for Sollio Agriculture. We now have 2 grain merchants on our local team. So Angela Wright, and about a year ago, Caitlin O'Connell Kennedy joined us as well. Our logistics coordinator for Atlantic Canada is Rosalind Saunders, and our trade administration team member is Jennifer Shannon. So for the past year, we have all been working remotely, and it looks like for 2021 that will continue. So the team has done a great job in transitioning over. They're all set up at home to keep the day-to-day service for our customers running as smoothly as possible. So what is driving commodity prices, and what do I think will happen? These are the top 2 questions that I get asked on a daily basis. Driving them is not hard to go through. What do I think will happen? It's anybody's guess. So we'll go through some of the things that are affecting, things that affect grain marketing today, which necessarily 10, 15 years ago was not the case. So simply put, in today's market, what's driving the huge upswing in values since September of last year is supply and demand. Supply and demand used to trade mostly on what were producers planting in North America, what was the short-term and long-range weather period going to be through planting season, summer season, and harvest season, and demand. Nowadays, those are only some components. So right now we're seeing low global stock numbers, and that started to come to the surface last September. We are seeing ongoing global weather issues, drought, flooding, wildfires, flash freezing on wheat right now in the US. The Beirut port explosion has a huge impact on the wheat demand last fall as well, that they're still recovering from. Lower yields. Globally, there's lower yields. Huge export demand. When we talk about export demand, the first thing that comes to mind for everybody is China, which is the key player, no doubt. But export demand in the last 6 months into Europe has also grown. It's just exploded. Italy, Cuba. The reason for that is because they had poor growing conditions last year and the year before, drought, so their yields were down quite a bit, and new trade laws in the grain industry over the last 2 and 3 years, new trade agreements, that is also creating a lot of demand out of Europe. They enjoy trading with Canada first. Non-commercial firms, so speculators. So these are people, day traders, these are fund management, insurance groups, unions, teachers unions, basically anybody who is outside of the actual farming community, who are playing and speculating in the marketplace. As of this morning, the most recent report came out showing that the non-commercial firms are currently long in their corn position. And what that means is if they start selling off anytime soon, or when they start selling off, if the demand has not peaked to the same level of the position that they've held, we'll see a huge drop in corn futures very rapidly in a matter of 1 day. Depends how many contracts they choose to sell at any given time. Politics. There is a lot of politics involved in all commodity trading now. Under the Trump administration, we've seen that more than ever. It really came to the front. So trade wars are under politics, hostage negotiations now. We see with China, the 2 gentlemen that they're holding, that has been ongoing with no end in sight. Human rights violations are being thrown in. And all of these issues, these political issues, are being leveraged on the food supply to one extent or another. And then we throw a global pandemic in the mix, and the market is uncharted waters. for even the most seasoned veteran analysts. We week after week after week, we see people that are 40 years, 50 years, they're close to retirement, and over again, the language that they're using, unheard of, unprecedented, how far will this go? So that's whenever they start looking historically at charts and start to try to predict what could happen. But every day that the pandemic grows, new strains come around. When will the end of the pandemic be? We don't know. What will the economic situation, continent to continent, country to country? We don't know. Those are all things that we don't know right now. So how does it affect the corn market? This is a chart that shows where corn prices were starting back in January 2020, when we started to see the rise and where we're at today. So the average, and this is all based on Chicago Board of Trade, okay? So the average a year ago essentially was just under $4 a bushel. We took a dip in April, May, June, and this is typical. This is planting season. And as long as planting is going well in the US and planting and growing is going well in South America, it's normal to see this type of downward trend. If growing and weather is going well through the summer, it's the same. Then we start to see September. Values have started to climb. And today we're trading at $5.50 a bushel. So the reason for that, on September 20th, the USDA quarterly stocks report were released and markets were off. So from noon on noon on this report to the 2:15 bell, so you're talking 2 hours and 15 minutes, corn had finished trading 14.25 cents per bushel up. Why? It's all based on the stock numbers. So the USDA pegged that September 1st stock numbers were 1.995 billion bushels. That was down from what analysts' average estimates of 2.265 billion bushels and well below their lowest estimates of 2.12. So the worst that they thought that they could get would be in and around this range, and they went below that range. So corn markets took off. September 2019, the first stock report stood at 2.2 billion bushels, 226 million higher than in 2020. So it shows a significant change in the demand from just 1 year previous, even during a pandemic. So the decrease in the above stocks implied that there'd been a stronger than expected use, and that is what started the bullish prices for corn. Corn prices have been on the rise ever since because demand continues to be strong. So this is a long, more of a historical graph to show the change in corn futures. And it's important that we look at what the historic's been to show where we are now and where the high in that point has been. So in 2008, corn markets, all commodity markets had started to take off. And this was because it was late 2007, early 2008. And this was because there was a drought in the US. It was a very dramatic drought, and it created prices to start going up. Then we seen the recession hit of 2008, late 2008, and prices started to drop after the mortgage and housing collapse in the US. Then we start to see things rise again, 2010, peaking 2011, a little dip in the spring, of course, and then back up 2012, and started to go down early 2013, and then a significant drop by the end of 2013. Supply and demand is what created this. Prices have been pretty stagnant throughout the next 5 years until the situation that we're finding ourselves in now. So as I said, the drought began, stock numbers started to get tight in 2006, then the drought hit of 2007 reduced yields carrying into the stock numbers of 2008. And the drought hit multiple countries, and they were all grain producing countries, not just North America. At the same time, the demand for oil was increasing, and the rise of oil prices had also began during the same period. So during that time frame, the demand from Asia started to grow as the middle class population demanded more choices in their diet. I know you've heard that multiple times before, but it is the reality. And more developing nations, for what's happening right now, they're also pushing for a greater variety in their diet, which is causing an additional demand on top of what China is looking for. So the higher oil prices drove up costs on inputs, food transportation, and industrial agriculture across the board. Demand fell dramatically in the last half of 2008 from the recession. And then 2011, 2012, we started to see it reaching new heights. It was a combination of higher demand, specifically on corn and soybean imports by China, at the same time as poor weather conditions created lower yields during the harvest of 2011. So they had gone hand in hand. So where does that leave us today? February 9th, the USDA put out their latest World Agricultural Stock Demand Estimates report. So corn prices softened a little bit after the USDA lowered the corn ending stock numbers by 50 million bushels. And at the market, as the market analyzed, the estimates had declined about 168 million bushels instead. So the analysts who have all their charts and historic data, and they're trying to monitor what's happening, they had estimated 160 million bushels, and USDA only lowered them by 50 million. Could there be a correction in March? Could be. Or were the analysts wrong? This is always a fine line between these USDA reports and what independent analysts feel. So when we see a significant difference in tonnage like that, bushels like that, we need to pay attention if you're somebody who's still sitting on corn looking to sell, especially hitting into March, because at any given time, if the USDA is right and the ending stock numbers have slowed by that much, then there needs to be a correction in corn futures, which would mean it would go down. If the USDA is wrong and there's a correction that comes out in the March report, the opposite effect will happen. The Chicago Board of Trade will go up. Who do you believe? You have to, you gotta just keep analyzing, you gotta keep reading, and it gives you an indication. Really, it's something that you have to decide yourself. This year, there's not a lot of people sitting on corn, so it's not really a decision they have to make at this point, but they are looking into new crop and what are they gonna plant this year. So since September, China has imported 6.1 million metric tons of American corn. So it has already exceeded the total that they had imported the previous year, which was 1.9 million metric ton. That's a significant difference in a short period of time. So to put it in perspective, in one single week in 2021 so far, and we're only at the end of February, China bought 5.86 million metric ton. In the previous year, their total corn purchases totaled 17 million metric ton. This is why the independent analysts feel that the USDA estimates are too low. The demand from China is not slowing, has not slowed. Prices haven't rationed. And if they compare year after year, where China has already purchased this significant amount, 5.86 million metric ton in a single week, it stands to reason that the USDA numbers are off. The USDA, they had an election in the meantime as well, and everybody knows no matter what news channel you turn on, there was always issues with getting information, getting up to speed on information, how much of the information was accurate. Agriculture was no different. The politics in the US with agriculture were swayed from time to time as well, based on the lobby groups, unfortunately. So our local corn market in Atlantic Canada. This is the 5-year average from StatsCan, which I'm happy to say they actually published early in January of this year, which was great because sometimes the most recent years it's much harder to get this data. So I was pleased to see that. So it's broke down by province. As you can see for corn, since 2016 to 2020, the harvested acres has been dropping. We've seen a slight increase 2020. And again, I believe it's because of, the hurricane we had in 2019. A lot of guys were saying, I'm going to grow corn because the area suffered not having enough corn and prices started to go up. Did anybody foresee where prices would be today compared to where they were early 2020? No, not at all, not at that time. So the yield averages over the past several years has been declining, mostly due to the weather in the region. It's not so much due to the acres, it's more due to the weather. The global export demand has increased during this time, driving prices up. The same results are felt locally, high demand creating higher prices, the same as they are globally. In the past 2 years, there's been a wide range of local prices for Atlantic Canada, depending on what region you live in. And I'm not talking just provinces, I'm talking regions within each province. In 2019, 2020, often local values were higher than replacement value. And so far for 2020, 2021, local values are right on par with replacement values. Supply is very, very tight. The only place that we see prices that are much higher than replacement values currently is northern New Brunswick. Buyers have bought very little from the producers in northern New Brunswick this year, simply because the numbers don't work. It's the first time, this will be my 4th year now, getting to know the Atlantic marketplace and building up the commercial program. And it's the first year that I've seen those values being much higher than replacement values. I believe from information that we're gathering and what those trades are, it's mostly farm to farm. So I'm not sure if it's because in those regions people can't get supply from other places, or if they're just choosing to kind of buy local. Maybe at the end of this year, we'll have a better indication of that. But right now, I'm not really sure what is driving those prices, because they are significantly higher than replacement value for what producers are looking for. So the wheat market. So the wheat market, we've seen the same trend over the last 12 months. On average, 6.5 per bushel was roughly where we were trading at on the futures market. We took a dip in March. Again, good planting at that point last year. Weather conditions were right. It's normal to see if early planting gets going. Planting intentions report is the big key here at the end of March. Weather pattern carried through the summertime. The crop looked good. Then they started harvesting in August. Wheat yields everywhere were down when harvest started. The United States, Canada, Western Canada, Ontario, Quebec, Atlantic Canada, they were down everywhere, creating the sharp increase that we started to see take off. So again, last September, the US quarterly stocks report was released and wheat started as well. So from noon to 2:15 on that one single day, wheat had finished up 28.5 cents per bushel, which was significant for wheat at that time, because for about the last 3 years prior to that point, wheat had been trading very sideways. Not a lot of gain in demand. It just wasn't doing anything. No export demand. It was very difficult to even get close to $300 a ton flat price at that point. So the USDA pegged the September 1st stocks at 2.159 billion bushels, which was 81 million bushels below the analyst expectations and 187 million bushels below the September 1st stock number of 2018. That's what sent the market on an increase. The report was less bullish for wheat than corn, but the wheat futures closely followed the price movement of the corn futures market. So again, we go back to 2005, sorry, is where we pulled the data. Again, all commodities in 2008, it was the same reason: supply, demand, low yields, weather. It's the same as corn, and you can see it followed pretty much the same flow, increasing 2011, 2012, and then a significant decline 2015, 16, 17. Not a lot happened over these 2 years. Slight spikes that normally happen whenever there was a huge purchase from China. If China canceled the purchase a month later, you see these large dips in this area here. So right now we're trading in and around the 651 range, which doesn't seem to be looking at stopping anytime soon. Actually, at this very moment, we're actually trading at 662 to date as of today. So February 9th of 2021, the new world stock demand estimates had come out. Wheat estimates were unchanged from previous months, and the prices continued to follow the daily movement of corn and soybeans. So not a lot of new news on wheat, but wheat, corn, and beans have pretty much been trading hand in hand since September of last year, because all of the commodities are in huge demand and they're all facing the same issues. China continues to be the story in wheat, with increased purchases from the US, and analysts forecast increased demand throughout 2021. It does not appear that the demand will be dropping. India has also been emerging as an increased source for export demand. Again, they're expanding the diet. Other sources that they would normally purchase wheat from, they've been having difficulty sourcing just because yields are down. Russia is a good example of that. Last December, Russia implemented a tax tariff. It took effect early January, I believe it became law. So the tariff on its producers is to curb the high exports of wheat. The government is trying to protect their own grain stock numbers. They've had some drought over the last couple of years as well, reducing yield. And with COVID-19, there's a lot of food protectionism starting to happen. The longer that the pandemic carries forward, you're going to start to see a lot more of that as well. Again, creating higher demands. So our local wheat acres for the last 5 years, we can see last year we had a significant increase in planted acres, and that is again because of the local demand and how high the prices went up locally. You can see from 2016 to 2019 there wasn't as significant as of a change, but after the hurricane had hit in 2019 and there wasn't enough corn because the corn was wiped out, it really drove up wheat prices and barley prices. So we've seen an increase in planted acres for 2020. Unfortunately, the yield had not stayed on par. The yield had dropped. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. We have more acres, but we have less yield. For the local feed industry, the quality is the other issue. There hasn't been a lot of feed wheat locally. A lot of the wheat had pretty much made milling quality, which is great for the producer. It creates those protein premiums, which is wonderful, but the feed price has actually caught right up with the milling price now. So as global export demand has increased, driving prices up, the same results are felt locally with high demand creating the higher prices. And as I had said, the feed wheat in 2019, pretty much everything had gone into feed wheat in 2019 of the local supply. The quality in 2019 didn't meet milling specs, so a lot of milling wheat was imported to meet those needs. But in 2020, 2021, it's the opposite. The local quality is very good, producing higher quality going into the mills. So now a lot of buyers are covered until the end of May, but May forward into new crop, sourcing wheat is a challenge. Soybeans. So soybeans is a big story as well. So a year ago, you can see soybeans were trading, same time period, let's take February, just under $9 a bushel. Today we are sitting at, this is based on February 9th, 1381. So to give you an indication, beans at this very moment are up 33.25 cents. So this number right here, as of this moment in today's trade, beans are trading at 14.17 a bushel. Significant increase in a short period of time. They started to take off in September after the quarterly report had come out yet again. And from noon till 2 p.m. on that trading day, I should say soybeans. Soybeans had gone up 29 cents a bushel. Same thing, USDA pegged the stock numbers at 523 million bushels, which was down 386 million bushels from the previous year and 55 million bushels below what the analysts had expected. Any kind of numbers where the groups do not agree triggers either a positive or negative reaction on Chicago Board of Trade for the day of the report. Sometimes there'll be a hold where nothing will trade for an hour. The market still trades, but buyers and sellers take a step back to give the market a minute to adjust and to settle into a groove, because the prices are trading so instantly that it's all done electronically now. So seconds, prices go up or down in seconds, having a huge effect if you're doing large volumes. So the soybean inventory estimates were not as impressive as corn and wheat, but still below what the previous estimates were. And if we go back to 2005, there's a lot of more erratic behavior in soybeans. South America plays the big role in that. But in 2008, 2012, 2013, the trend was the same. Now, what accounts here for this dip from 2017 to fall of 2020? This is China. So China's demand for proteins in soybeans had dropped significantly because of the swine flu that wiped out the herd across China. And we will talk about that a little bit more. So on February the 9th, the world estimates had come out again. Soybean prices softened a bit after the USDA decreased the ending stock numbers by 20 million bushels versus their January report. So a lot can change from month to month. The reduction was in line with market expectations, so the price didn't change that much. It was just simply following the slight decline in prices that we were seeing in the corn market. At the time of February 9th, the USDA didn't make any changes to the soybean production numbers in Argentina or Brazil at that time. But to date, and when I say to date, it's about last week, the latest information, harvest in South America progress was way behind the national average. So harvest progress was only at 4% versus 16% the same time last year. And bean harvest is very late due to the high rainfall, creating really slow progress. At the current pace, they are the slowest harvest in 10 years. The high demand throughout the years reduced the inventories. So Brazil is literally sitting there waiting for the new harvest before they can resume any exports. It was great for the North American exporter it was great for the North American soybean exporters for the past 5 months because they've been picking up that shortfall that South America hasn't been able to supply to the market. For South America and for the global markets, last week, the effect of this delay in harvest and the rainfall making it difficult for the harvest to actually get to port, because that is a huge challenge in South America. Roadways get wiped out. So even though trucks are sitting there loaded with supply, they can't get it to the ports. Midweek last week, there were 10 vessels that were anchored off the coast waiting for the soy supply to fill the vessels. That's how tight soybean stocks are everywhere. It's having a ripple effect all the way through the supply chain. So the delays in the soya harvest is creating a ripple effect again, major corn planting delays, because in South America, as the combines are going harvesting, they are directly behind planting corn. So on February 9th, they had only planted 3.4% versus 23% at the same time frame a year ago. And that's what's keeping corn futures up at the moment. That's what's driving Chicago Board of Trade at the moment, because they're looking at the stock numbers and looking at how they're going to get through the rest of the year based on the current global demand if the buying pattern remains the same. So for our local market, the Atlantic acres have been dropping. The big reason for this, if we do a comparison from 2017 to now, pea acres has been the biggest issue on the island. Peas have been taking up a lot of the soybean acres from these points that you used to see growing in 2016, 2017. So the decline in acres, understanding from the producer standpoint, for sure, lower prices. Prices were low at some points. Beans were trading at $260 flat price Canadian per metric ton, 305, 310, depending on what part of Canada you were in, province to province, and if you were close to an export port or not. Further away you are, the more expensive transportation is. So a lot of guys, it just wasn't worth. They were able to grow more corn at a better value than what they could do for soybeans. The reason why the demand had gone down so much was because of the hog industry being wiped out in China. So what we're seeing now is global demand has increased, driving prices up. The same results are being felt locally. High demand is creating higher prices. And we have been developing Sollio Agriculture has been developing container and vessel export programs out of the Port of Halifax for the past 4 years. And based on the amount of forward contracting for fall 2020, from our suppliers, there appears to be a big shift in soybean acres this year. So it will be interesting to see what the actual planted acres are. Some of those acres I know for a fact are coming from peas. Other acres, growers who are growing non-GMO and IP beans, because of the high price of crusher beans being shipped out of Halifax right now, they've chosen to go the crusher bean route. And it doesn't look like the crusher bean demand will drop throughout 2021. So it's the largest amount of forward contracting that we've seen in the 4 years that I've been in Atlantic Canada. This is just a little snapshot of the Port of Halifax there. So barley. Barley is a little different. Barley is a non-hedgeable commodity, which means it only trades on flat price per metric ton. And the prices the last 2 years have been steadily increasing. If you look at the acres planted, we've seen a big increase again in 2020. And from every producer that I've spoken to, the reason for this is simply price. Demand and price. There's not a lot of growers in Ontario and Quebec that produce a lot of barley anymore. A lot of the livestock industry in Quebec, the feed industry, has been formulating barley out of formulations simply because they weren't able to get a consistent supply. And because it is a non-hedgeable commodity, they take a lot of risk in buying flat price barley. But here in Atlantic Canada, it's still in high demand. And for those feed mills that do still use a significant amount of barley in their rations in Quebec, they pull a lot of supply of barley from Atlantic Canada, especially in the last 2 years. Oh, sorry. Okay, so in 2020, we've seen an increase in the acres from 2019 to 2020, but we've seen a decrease in weight, in yield again. So this is keeping the pressure on that barley price. The prices have ranged dramatically, again, depending on which region you live in. Not necessarily province to province, but region to region. So right now in Prince Edward Island, we had offers, just for example, on Monday, we had offers in Prince Edward Island. The offers that we were receiving from one region in PEI compared to another ranged by $18 a ton, which at this time of the year is a significant range, but the higher end, they were very honest, farm to farm. So farmers are paying the higher price on the island to get the supply. There hasn't been a lot of product from New Brunswick this year because they did suffer quite a bit, colder weather, wet weather at planting time, and they just didn't have the same results compared to the rest of Atlantic Canada. It had dropped quite a bit. So barley that we normally would pull from New Brunswick to feed all the Moncton mills, it hasn't been there this year. So the local mills in Moncton are pulling more from the island as well, driving prices up. So we'll look at proteins a little bit here. A lot of questions on protein values, what's driving protein values. And this chart here shows from January again, 2020, and what we've seen happen up to this point. It directly correlates with what is happening on soybean prices and canola prices, sorry. The demand out of China for proteins has been significant. Europe has been importing a lot of proteins in the past year as well. This is our historic chart. Same trends. You can see where the demand comes and goes. Again, here for the 2018, roughly 2019, when China was pretty much out of the buying market because there was just no export demand. They needed time to recover and to rebuild their hog industry, which everybody knew. Was it going to be 18 months, 24 months, or 36 months? That's the part that we didn't know. And with information that comes out of China, it's difficult to confirm. Sometimes they put out information that isn't necessarily accurate, as they're playing politics. So this is a perfect example. So in December 2020, Chinese officials published that they would have expected that they had rebuilt their hog industry by 90% of their herd. And that this is where the sharp increases for price in recent months had stemmed from. Recent reports, just as of 2 weeks ago, pretty much, February 22nd. So just as of yesterday, actually, there was some speculation leading up to it, but there was like an official report out yesterday. So recent reports are speculating that these figures from China are not accurate, as northern China is seeing increased cases of swine flu with mutated strains. And some of the numbers being floated around by analysts is that 30% of the herd is infected again, and that things has a potential to move quickly. Time will tell. It's a very difficult virus to get under control. If that is the case and the virus does pick up and moves forward, that could create a reduction in demand. But what will be the timing on it? None of us know. And maybe the analysts are wrong. Maybe what China is saying is true. Only time will tell for that. So crushing facilities have been pushed to the max over the past 7 months to keep up with the demand. And they're all at a point where things are of great concern now for the summer months. It used to be that you could get 12-month averages, you could get 12-month supply. Honestly, for the last 5 months, 6 months, they'll publish a 2-month supply, then they won't guarantee that they can give you supply. And heading into the summer months, that is really becoming a great concern. They base their forecasts on the ending stock numbers. And I'm sure many of you have read Western Canada is quite concerned because the ending stock numbers of canola are very, very depleted, to the point that growers in Western Canada are planning to increase their planted acres for 2021 to try to meet the demand and to help offset the prices a little bit. So the protein prices have been extremely volatile, creating situations where supply offers get pulled at a moment's notice. It is truly a minute-by-minute situation for the past 3 months. As supply drops, the basis increases to try to curb the demand. And they've been talking about curb demand since late November, speculating how high can the prices go before rationing begins. Analysts were anticipating that rationing on proteins would have already started back early December, and every day that goes by and there's no rationing of the product and demand continues to climb, prices go higher, it sets new thresholds, new trends. So it's anybody's guess as to how high the market can go. So domestic demand, since fall of 2020, the local market's been trading mostly on spot loads for Atlantic Canada. I'm not speaking for Ontario or Western Canada, mostly for Atlantic Canada. The reason for that is the tight supply. Due to the tight supply, the opposite occurred the last half of 2020. So in Atlantic Canada, people used to book an annual contract, 9-month contract, but they were hoping that prices would go down, and that just hasn't happened. So in recent weeks, and I'm talking since the 1st of March, roughly, pretty much after we returned from holidays and the January USDA report came out, last week of January, first week of February, there's been a surplus of supply in Quebec. And it's not because they're producing more, it's because people who took out contracts buying protein supply earlier in the fall are long in their contract positions. So the effects of COVID-19 are creating production issues. Quebec is being hit hard from the restaurant industry, has been locked down for a significant period of time, curfews, and what's happening is producers are producing more than what they can sell, and it's being felt everywhere. So customers are not taking the supply of their proteins on a weekly basis that they had purchased. And this situation, combined with daily margin calls as Chicago Board of Trade rises, the companies who own the supply have to move product as fast as they can. And what we're seeing is that prices vary dramatically all over the place, day to day, some cases a few hours apart. You might not have supply at 10 in the morning and 2 hours later, someone's trying to offload 100 ton. And what we're seeing in the last 3 weeks is a lot of that supply is actually being sold below cost. So the Canadian dollar here, I'll just go through these quickly because I think we've got about 15 minutes left. The Canadian dollar since January of 2020 to February 2021 has been on an upward trend continuously. And again, same as with the commodity markets, you can see trends in the time period. The ups and downs correlate with 2008 oil prices going up. 2011, 12, same thing, then a significant drop. demand on everything had dropped, and we're starting to see an increase. But you can see even trading at 78 3/4 is still far off from where these peaks were in 2008, 2011, 2012, where the dollar was at par and some days above par. So I just wanted to do a little example to show the currency impact, because when we give price quotes, we always say price subject to change. And sometimes people are frustrated if they give if we give them a price at say 11 o'clock and they call back a half an hour later and the flat price has changed significantly. So I just want to give a little example as to how those types of situations can happen. So the market trades on US basis. So anything that we trade, buy and sell, anything on Chicago Board of Trade, we're always trading in US basis. But when we're buying or selling grain or proteins, we start with the US basis and convert the offer to producers or customers based on their marketing plan. So different parts of the country, people trade differently. Atlantic Canada, the majority is flat price per metric ton. We do have a few growers, especially on the soybeans, that started playing in the Canadian basis contracts this past year. Other parts of the country, it's only US basis that they trade. So we're always converting the values based on what our customer needs are. So I put together just this little indication. So from the previous chart, when the average for the past year, from January 2020 to January 2021, the average currency was 75 cents and a quarter roughly. Today, we're at 79 and a quarter. So if you were selling corn or wheat or soybean to us, the lower Canadian dollar has helped you in the first half of January 2020. And the reason for that is it keeps your flat prices higher when the currency is lower. So in this example, you can see this is Chicago Board of Trade. So in column A, 545 3/4. Same futures in column B, 545 3/4. The US currency, the dollar, for example 1 is only 75. The dollar in example 2 is 79. Your US basis for each month is exactly the same, $1.85, $1.85. See the currency conversion? This is your Canadian basis. The lower dollar gives you a higher Canadian basis, creating a higher Canadian flat price per metric ton. The higher Canadian dollar gives you a lower Canadian basis, and look at the significant change in your Canadian flat price per metric ton. So there are days where guys are watching the Chicago board go up, and I get calls and they're like, oh, it went up 5 cents today, I should be able to hit this. And then I have to say, well, yeah, but currency went in this direction or basis went in this direction. So we get a lot of questions on that. And I'm happy to go through this one-on-one with customers more in depth if you have questions on this anytime. So if you were buying grains or proteins from us, the higher Canadian dollar was helping you in the last half of 2021 if you were flat pricing in a Canadian per metric ton value. So a basic overview of what analysts are watching in 2021. Supply and demand are the daily topics, as rationing has not begun. The questions these days are not about price. The question daily is, where are we going to get our hands on supply? And this is everything. The most recent is DDGs. As of this morning, 5 major ethanol producing facilities in the United States are going offline. They can't compete because the corn prices are too high. So that's going to pull DDG's supply out of a lot of rotation, which is going to create problems for end users again. What will producers plant this spring? What are they? They're currently being surveyed in the US right now. The USDA planting intentions report gets released on March 31st. So it's a big report. Locally, what will happen in Atlantic Canada? What will you grow? Will you be sticking to rotation? Will you wait for the March 31st report and see what our neighbors are growing and how it impacts prices? In the last 2 weeks, I've been getting calls. Guys on the island are actually switching acres out of barley and wheat, and they're going to soybeans just because of the significant increase in soybeans. And once they've calculated their input costs. So how will the seeding intentions report affect the global market? What will the supply and demand numbers be on March 31st? That's going to be a big indicator if anybody's going to switch anything up. How did harvest progress in South America? So by the time the March 31st report comes out, we will know on average what the yields are from the South American harvest. Where will the global export be at that time? March 31st is only a month away, but a lot can happen in the grain world in a month. What will oil prices be trading at? What will the short and long-term weather range be? Will there be any planting delays? So these are all issues that come into play when that March 31st report comes out as to how the market will react on that day when that report is issued. Currency and oil prices as well will affect those issues. For your local market, high US basis due to demand combined with high futures, the trend creates selling opportunities. Traditionally, February to March futures start to soften as the trade awaits planting intentions, weather, planting. The planting progress report sets the tone for April to May, and the June USDA recap of what acres actually got planted and what the weather is supposed to be. So the long range, they always go with the 60 and 90-day weather platform. That will set the tone for the prices throughout the summer. Reward the market when the market rewards you. So look at your selling your supply at different price points to create a positive average for your overall crop. I've been working with, since the online portal came on board about a year ago, I've been working with a lot of growers on developing their marketing plan over the past year. And so far they've been successful, happy. It's been successful. They have been happy with the outcome to date. So now you can watch your local market selling opportunities 24 hours a day through the online portal. We have alternate delivery destinations as export demands. So even though we might only be buying one variety of soybean into Halifax for export, when you're on the online portal, you can pick every place that we can deliver for you within our network. So for example, if you put the province of Quebec in, you would see that we would be taking IP soybeans at this facility. This is our TSH facility. The port of Sillery has gone under major construction. There's still construction happening, but I can happily say they were receiving their first rail cars in January. And there are multiple delivery opportunities going into Sillery because of every place that we're exporting out of Sillery now. So that benefits you as well, gives you more options. So this is just a quick, I'll show you initially what it looks like, but the customer grain portal is called Ag Connection. They are, they've been improving the site over and over again over the past year. So far, test subjects and customers who have been using it for the past 6-7 months, it's all been very positive feedback that they've been giving me. And so much to the point, you know, it's being used well whenever people complain, whenever it's crashed for a day. And in the past year with everybody working from home and stuff, there has been times where that has happened as well, but you receive a message. So the way that you get an invitation to join the online portal, you have to be a customer. So if you're not currently a customer, we would get you set up with supplier forms, and we would get you set up. You would then receive an invitation. This is just a basic invitation. None of the names or any dollar amounts or anything on here is any live information. It's all test information, just so you're aware. So you would get a training session that looks a lot like this. Someone will be on the phone, whether you want your local merchant to do it or someone from the Ag Connection support team will go through it with you. You can add additional users to the portal. You can modify your password anytime that you want. But this is basically what the screen looks like. So you're welcome to the Sollio portal. Grain prices, you'll be able to view prices, any grain transactions. So what that means is any of your tickets or settlements. So when we buy grain, we pay in 10 business days. Usually the tickets are processed within 24 hours. So you can get copies of your tickets, your weights, your grading discounts, usually within 24 hours, and your settlement as well to show you what you're getting paid and the date of payment is all accessible now on your account. So this is just an indication as to what it looks like. As I said, they've updated it a little bit, but this is just a quick overview of what you could expect to see. So basically up here, you would select whichever province you're looking to sell into. So if Prince Edward Island, a lot of the guys go on and they'll pick Nova Scotia, so they could see Truro Mill and Moncton Mill and Halifax. Everything is under there. They would pick their commodity. So any location that we're delivering to would come up here, where we're buying into, sorry. And then every month that we're offering values would be listed here. So it shows you the delivery month, your flat price in Canadian and US, what your Canadian basis is, your US basis, what futures months the futures are trading over, and what Canadian futures month is trading at as well, what the last futures were. Over here, this is a book now. So if you click on this, you can actually book your prices online. And you will get a message that will pop up that tell you somebody will contact you within this time frame. I believe it is 15 minutes that they allow us to give you a shout back. In the beginning, there was some tech issues. The messages weren't getting through to your local merchants, but in the last 5 months, I don't think that there's been any issues with that whatsoever. Everybody's been very happy with it. You can book your sale request. You put in what kind of contract you want to do, what currency you want it, how many ton you want it, and you put your phone number and you submit your request. It gives you a confirmation. It gives you the terms and conditions. Oh, sorry about that. It would show you your account number, what you were looking to book. So the computer generates it so that at this time, it tells you exactly what it was whenever you wanted to book it. Contact information, any general question inquiries you can put right on there. And that is pretty much what it looks like. I'm sorry to rush through it, but it's a lot of information to pack into an hour. So I am happy to take any questions if we still have time. If not, you're more than welcome to reach me anytime individually. I do work with a lot of growers, as I said, for the marketing plans and how they can utilize the Ag Connection portal and build a marketing plan off of that.
Awesome. Thanks, Catherine. We probably have time for 1 or 2 questions. If there's any, you can type it in the chat box or raise your hand. If not, then I'd like to thank Catherine for speaking with us today. And we'd like to give a little thank you to her, and a donation is going to be made in her honor for Better School Food Nova Scotia. We really appreciate you spending an hour with us today, Catherine.
Thank you very much. That's very it's well needed for sure, and I appreciate speaking. And I sorry if I talked a little too fast. We're trying to pack in quite a bit of information, so please don't hesitate anytime to reach out, and we can go in more depth with any questions that anybody may have.
Awesome, thanks. Now we're going to switch gears. We had a bit of technical issues earlier this afternoon, so we're going to flip into learning about some BT resistant rootworm that's popping up in Ontario and some methods that we can maybe implement to help us before they come into our neck of the woods.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Tracy Bowdy, the field crop entomologist with OMAFRA. This is session 22, all about BT-resistant corn rootworm in Ontario. We have three very good speakers today to discuss this issue. First, we'll have Dr. Jocelyn Smith, scientist in field crop entomology at the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus. She specializes in insect resistance management for transgenic corn. Her research activities include collaboration with commodity organizations, feed and pesticide industries, public researchers, and government specialists to develop management strategies for the key pests in corn, soybeans, and wheat. After Jocelyn, it will be Christine O'Reilly, the forage and grazing specialist in OMAFRA. Her area of focus includes forage and grazing within cropping systems, forage production and grazing systems for Northern Ontario, and improving the productivity and profitability of forages. Christine will be talking about alternatives to growing corn for both grain and livestock producers to better enable rotation of corn to knock back a rootworm population. And finally, we'll have third, Dr.
There's a little bit of background noise, I think, from the video, so we'll just try to play through and see if it gets better once the presenters start talking.
Dr. Elson Shields, he's been a professor at Cornell University Entomology Department for 34 years. Infestations in northern New York caused his lab to start a new research direction to control alfalfa snout beetle with native occurring entomopathogenic nematodes or biocontrol nematodes. Now, 30 years later, snout beetle is under control, and he's turning and proving that these nematodes are also effective on corn rootworm. Elson will talk about his research on these biocontrol nematodes and their role in helping to reduce resistant rootworm populations and potentially restore our durability of rootworm BT hybrids. But first up is Jocelyn. She'll go over the impact of rootworm and resistance development here in Ontario and what the recommended management strategies are.
Okay, so let's quickly first review what we need to know about rootworm. There are two species of corn rootworm, the northern corn rootworm and the western corn rootworm. And as adult beetles, they do look different, but as larvae, they're basically indistinguishable, and they both cause the same type of injury to corn. The western corn rootworm has the yellow and black wavy stripes on its wings, and the northern corn rootworm is green without any stripes. Next, let's review the life cycle of the corn rootworm. And if we start in the summertime when the beetles are active in the crop, this is when they are feeding on corn pollen, corn leaves, and corn silks. They're hanging out in the field, mating, and laying their eggs in the soil. Typically, corn rootworm beetle feeding isn't a significant economic problem unless there's silk clipping or there's really heavy populations. But the eggs that they lay in the soil are where the problem really gets rolling. The eggs overwinter in the soil and hatch in early June each year. If corn is present in the field, the larvae begin to feed on the root hairs of the corn plants. And as they feed for about a month or so, they get larger, doing more and more root feeding. And this can lead to yield loss, goosenecking of the plants as they try to compensate as they lose root mass, and then lodging later on. But those beetles must have corn in the field to survive. So this is why crop rotation is the best way to manage corn rootworm larvae. If the corn isn't there, they're going to die. If they're feeding on corn in the summer, they finish that feeding around mid to late July and pupate in the soil. And then the adult beetles begin to emerge in late July and they're present in the field into the fall. And there's just one generation of this pest per year. So as we're talking today about BT resistance in corn rootworm, This has been one of the main ways that we've come to manage corn rootworm if you're growing continuous corn in the past. We started using BT corn for rootworm in about 2003 in both Canada and the US. And the original proteins for rootworm are listed here in this table. So Monsanto's Cry3BB1 protein was first available in Yield Guard rootworm and Ingenuity Triple Pro hybrids. Dow came out with Cry3435 that was in Herculex rootworm hybrids. And then Syngenta came out with Cry3A, which is in the Agrisure rootworm hybrids. So originally these are all sold singly in corn hybrids. But as time has gone on, companies have started producing hybrids that express a pyramid of these proteins, or more than one, targeting the same pest, being corn rootworm in this case. And the point of that was to improve our resistance management, as the chances of developing resistance to two proteins with different modes of action at the same time would be less likely. And so Cry3BB1 and Cry3435 are the two proteins that are available in SmartStax hybrids. Cry3A and Cry3435 are available in Optimum AcreMax Extreme, Chrome, and some Agrisure products. And then Syngenta has most recently pyramided Cry3A with Cry3.1AB in their Duracade products. And here, whoops. I lost my, did that happen? Okay, there we go, sorry. So let's also now review the way we've been managing resistance with BT corn since it was first developed. And the primary way was through a high dose refuge strategy. So a high dose BT corn product kills 99% of the target population. And this includes all of the susceptible genotypes, as well as any heterozygous resistant insects in the population. Homozygous resistant insects to a high dose product are very rare in the population. And then the refuge part of this concept is that you have a portion of the field with non-BT corn that would enable survival of a bunch of insects that are susceptible without having any exposure to the protein, that would mate with any potentially rare resistant survivors from the BT portion of the field to keep resistance genes low in the population. Now you'll notice that the pests in the pictures here that I've shared with you, that Stefanzo made from Michigan State University, are of European corn borer. And when BT corn was first developed, this strategy was designed around European corn borer, where we had high dose proteins. Now, unfortunately, we've had some differences with this corn rootworm situation. We tried to apply the high dose refuge strategy to this situation, but it doesn't quite work as well. And that's partly because these resistance genes are not as rare in rootworm populations to begin with. And so we've never been able to achieve this high dose criteria. And we can mainly say that the rootworm proteins are moderate dose at best. Also, rootworms don't move around as much as corn borers, so there's less mixing and opportunity for mixing of while they're mating between susceptible and resistant beetles. So because of these reasons, corn rootworm have developed resistance to BT proteins in a relatively short time. Cry3BB1, that first Monsanto trait, was originally planted in 2003, and we had resistance by 2009 in the US. And with the other rootworm traits, we've had resistance developed, all of them within 8 years of commercialization. Resistance most often happens when there's continuous use of BT corn hybrids, and this is often related with livestock producers who need that land for feed, but it can also happen in cash crop situations as well. And lastly, there's a problem with cross resistance among these BT rootworm proteins. So generally, if rootworm develop resistance to Bayer's Cry3BB1 protein, they will also be cross-resistant to both of Syngenta's proteins. Cry3435 is a slightly different protein. The other three are very similar in their structure and mode of action, which is why there's so much cross-resistance. But although Cry35 is quite different, we're starting to see resistance problems with that as well now too. So this resistance is pretty widespread in the US, and we're starting to see it in Canada now as well. In the last number of years, we only had a handful of cases to investigate, but in 2019 and 2020, the number of cases has really increased. And in 2020, we even had some producers lose about 50% of their silage yields. And we're seeing most of our cases associated with heavy livestock production areas such as Huron and Perth counties. So we need to consider BT resistance on a regional level, not just for an individual farmer. If there are BT resistant corn rootworm populations in your neighborhood, these become the source of resistance that then move into later planted fields nearby as they're looking for more to eat. So therefore the neighbor's field becomes the sink of that resistance, and it may be an unfortunate surprise if they grow corn in that field the next year. So what are we going to do if BT resistance is developing or is already present? Crop rotation is still the #1 way to alleviate the problem. Rotating corn rootworm hybrids, BT hybrids, unfortunately, is becoming less and less of an option because of this cross resistance among the proteins and also the cross licensing of the proteins amongst all the seed companies. Soil insecticides work just as well as BT hybrids still to control corn rootworm if you have the equipment for that. And the high rate neonic seed treatments are effective on low to moderate rootworm populations. So either of those options are useful in the right setting. But we don't recommend that you use either of those on top of a BT rootworm hybrid because this is just masking resistance. So for the rest of the talk, Christine O'Reilly is going to discuss crop rotation options for livestock producers who are limited as they need corn for feed. And then Dr. Shields is going to share some interesting data on biocontrol nematodes that might be used to supplement our rootworm control options, whether it's BT or otherwise.
Thanks, Jocelyn. So as Dr. Smith said, I'm going to be talking about some crop rotation options to help us knock back the corn rootworm population and get ahead of this BT resistance issue. So as Jocelyn highlighted in her talk, if we're growing continuous corn, we're providing in the first year a place for corn rootworm beetles to lay their eggs. In the second year, there's food there for those rootworm larvae to eat. They mature into adults, they lay their eggs in the same field. In the third year, those eggs hatch into larvae, and the population just keeps building and building as we grow continuous corn. When there's BT proteins in there as well, the rootworm are exposed to proteins, they're very adaptable bugs, and we develop resistance very, very quickly. So the best way to suppress the population as a whole, both resistant and non-resistant bugs, is to take their food source away. So when we're looking at crop rotation as an option to manage rootworms, our best bet is to pick a non-host plant so that there's the maximum amount of rootworm larva starvation happening in that field. So we know for sure that dicots are not hosts. Their root structure is totally wrong for rootworms. So if you can plant a legume, whether that's alfalfa or clover or soybeans, maybe look at a brassica such as canola or possibly beets, all of these dicot plants are not hosts. They don't provide a feed source. Some grass species are not hosts for rootworm. So these are options that we can potentially use in situations where legumes are not a good fit or other dicots are not a good fit. Winter cereals have root development at the wrong time of year for corn rootworm larvae to feed on. So winter cereals have developing root hairs in the fall and early spring. Rootworm larvae aren't active until the summer. There's no feed there for them. They're likely to starve. Sorghum species have a different mode of action that makes them non-hosts for corn rootworm larvae. Their roots exude natural chemicals that are toxic to the larva. So in the same way that we can sometimes get prussic acid poisoning in livestock if they eat stressed sorghum plants, the stress of having little rootworms nibbling on those root hairs will cause sorghum species to exude durin, which breaks down into cyanide and kills the larva. So while those types of grass species are not hosts, there are some grass species that are. Corn is a grass, and other species that have similar root structure can sometimes enable a smaller amount of rootworm larvae to reach adulthood and to survive. So they could become a bridge between corn crops if we're not careful. So when we think about this issue from a broader scale, there are actually 3 different types of producers that are affected by this BT resistance issue. Grain farmers, livestock producers that are growing grain and high moisture corn for feed, and livestock producers that are growing corn silage. And this is really important to understand because we have a unique opportunity in front of us. When BT resistant corn rootworm first became an issue in the US, the Americans treated this as a crop production problem, which it is, but we know that it's also a feed supply issue. And to make sure that we're really addressing this issue and we're making recommendations that will help us successfully rotate out of corn and knock back that population, we have to understand why producers are growing corn and how they're using it. Because without that information, our recommendations won't make sense and we won't be able to get ahead of this pest. So the biggest impact that corn rootworm has on a crop is yield loss. When we look at experience and at research, we see that about 15 to 18% yield loss occurs with every loss of a set of nodal roots. And that is true whether it's for grain corn or for silage corn. However, that gets exacerbated in silage corn because as those plants lodge, we are not able to pick them up the same way we might be able to salvage a grain crop. So silage corn, because the risk of getting ash contamination and clostridial contamination in the silage is so high, more of that crop ends up left in the field. So this year, a producer in Ontario had 50% yield loss in a silage crop, and it's because it lodged and we couldn't pick it up again. So this is something that within a couple of years could significantly impact the economics of growing corn if we don't collectively start managing for rootworm in other ways. So grain farmers, why do they grow corn? They need a crop to sell, and there's a market for corn, but there's also markets available for other crops. So from a rootworm management perspective, there's really no excuse to not implement a good crop rotation. And there are plenty of other talks that you can listen to at this conference explaining other benefits of a good crop rotation. So I won't go into those here, but because grain farmers don't need to grow corn on corn, they are never required to be in a situation that is high risk for rootworm damage. So since every year they grow corn is a first year cornfield, there's also no need for grain producers to be using rootworm BT hybrids. They're still able to use BT traits that target European corn borer and Western bean cutworm, so those above ground pests, but there's no place for those rootworm BT hybrids in first year corn. So grain farmers going forward should not be needing those. They've also got a couple of opportunities that may become a little bit more clearer as I move on with my talk. There may be a chance that the years of field is in corn, they land swap with a livestock producer, or they may find markets to grow grains as livestock feed to sell to feed mills or to livestock producers in their area. So I've said this is a livestock issue, and here really is the slide that illustrates why. All of those orange fields on the map are fields that have been in corn for at least 3 years. And you'll notice that many of the pockets with high concentrations of orange fields also overlap with areas that have high amounts of livestock production. So while we recognize that livestock producers are not the only people who grow continuous corn, they have more incentive to do so because they need a consistent quality and quantity of feed. All right, so livestock producers that are growing grain and high moisture corn are producers that may have monogastric livestock such as poultry or pigs, or they may have ruminant livestock such as cattle or sheep. And the reason that they're growing grain and high moisture corn is because they need an energy source for those animals' diets. So this slide is illustrating energy in a couple of different ways. The second column, DE, is digestible energy that's commonly used for our monogastrics, whereas TDN, total digestible nutrients, is more commonly used to compare feedstuff for ruminants. And you can see that all of the small grains listed on this slide have a lot of energy. They're not necessarily the same as corn, but they're comparable to corn, and they could be quite easily used as energy sources in livestock rations. The third column in blue, CP, is crude protein. And I've included this because crude protein is not a measure of energy. It's a different nutrient that livestock need. But you will notice that all of these small grains listed here have higher crude protein than corn does. I'm showing you this to illustrate that when we're switching and substituting a small grain for corn, it's not a one-to-one switch. There are lots of other nutrients in these grains, and they're going to be different than the nutrients we find in corn. So absolutely get a nutritionist on board early and find out what their preference is in terms of substitution, because depending on the type of livestock that they're feeding, they're going to have different preferences as to what is going to help that animal continue to be healthy and productive. Since this isn't a crop conference and we're having an agronomy talk, I really want to highlight the last column on this slide, that average yield. You will notice that corn, when it's not affected by rootworms, has by far the highest yield potential of any of the crops listed on this slide. These are averages coming from Ontario Stats. So what this really means to us from an agronomic perspective is producers raising livestock are going to have to find more acres or buy in more feed. I do want to address the little asterisk beside the yield for fall rye. It's significantly lower than winter wheat, and it is lower than our spring cereals. Based on plot work done by the Ontario Cereal Crops Committee, fall rye has a very similar yield potential to winter wheat, but the reason that that's so much lower in the stats, we suspect, is due to a lack of management. Rye fields are not typically getting the same level of management as winter wheat. So if the nutritionist gives you a choice, winter cereals tend to have higher grain yield potential than spring cereals, but the motivating factor for which cereal gets grown in place of corn is really going to come down to what is going to best meet the animal's nutritional needs. When it comes to silage, silage is being grown for ruminant rations. So whether these are beef or dairy cattle or for sheep, and silage does something different than grain and high moisture corn. It does supply an energy source for that diet, but it also provides fiber. And those two nutrients are going to vary. Corn is going to be different than some of our other options. But you can see on this slide that some of our best options are non-hosts, which is great. Some of our options are potential hosts, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I've stuck alfalfa in on the bottom to again illustrate that some of these substitutions are complicated. So alfalfa is not typically used as an energy source in a ration. It's a protein and fiber source instead of an energy and fiber source. So from an agronomic perspective, it's a fantastic rotation option. It's a dicot, it's a legume, it's not going to host corn rootworm. But from a ration point of view, it can't deliver what silage corn does. So that's the kind of thing that the producer and the nutritionist and the agronomist all need to work together to make sure that these substitutions are going to make sense. The thing I really want you to take away from this again is looking at that yield potential column. So if corn is not suffering from rootworm damage, nothing else touches it for yield. And that's where some of the planning to make sure we have enough feed is going to be very, very important. So one option for replacing silage corn is looking at a double crop to really get that maximum yield. By combining the production of a winter cereal and a sorghum species within one calendar year, we can actually exceed the yield potential of a single silage corn crop. Both of these grasses are non-hosts, which is great. One of the challenges, though, is that this crop option will need an energy supplement. So silage corn has a huge amount of starch in it that both winter cereals and sorghum species lack. So the nutritionist will have to come up with some sort of energy replacement in addition to the tonnage we're getting from growing these crops. Another concern people bring up is potential allelopathy. Fall rye has been used for weed suppression in some situations, and my best suggestion is if allelopathy from fall rye is a concern, switch to winter triticale. It's much less of a risk with that crop. Allelopathy can be an issue with sorghum species as well, but we tend to only see that when the seeding rate is extremely high. So historically, we were planting sorghums at 20 to 25 pounds an acre. Recently, I've been seeing 30 to 40 as more normal. But once you get up kind of 40 pounds or higher, there's a chance that allelopathy is going to affect the next crop in rotation. So rather than pushing seeding rates, which is often done to keep palatability high and lignin low, consider a BMR hybrid. They don't seem to have the yield drag that we see in corn, and potentially consider sedan grass as opposed to any of the sorghums, because the leaves are finer and the stems are smaller. So that increases palatability and decreases lignin as well. Ryegrass is another potential option, especially for people who don't want to grow sorghums. Annual ryegrasses, it's kind of a catch-all term. There's actually two different types of ryegrass there. Italians are like winter cereals in that they have a vernalization requirement before they set seed. Westerwolds are more like spring cereals. They don't need to get cold before they try to head out. The challenge we have with ryegrasses is that in laboratory studies, they are potential hosts. Rootworm larvae could survive on ryegrass. But when we look at experience in the field in Europe, when they plant corn after 4 or 5 years of ryegrass, they don't see any rootworm issues. So if ryegrass is something that a producer is considering, I would suggest having it in the ground for at least 3 years, just to make sure none of those resistant rootworms are bridging over, or they're not going to survive on that ryegrass to get to your next corn crop. Ryegrasses are also incredibly hungry. They have a similar nitrogen demand to corn. You need 50 pounds of N per acre up front and another 50 after each cut, except the final one for the year. But they are highly digestible. They have very low lignin, very high water soluble carbohydrates, and this makes them really digestible. So animal intakes are going to go up. And when intakes go up, we need more acres to meet that feed demand. We already know that the yield potential is lower than silage corn, so we need more acres again. It can be tough to find these acres, but one of the cool things about ryegrasses is it will have a higher crude protein content than most other grasses if it's given enough nitrogen. So you may be able to steal some acres out of alfalfa if need be. When you're picking a variety, I'd encourage you to use a tetraploid Westerwold if you're doing a spring seeding, because both of those have higher yield potentials. The Westerwold's higher than the Italian, and the tetraploid are higher than a diploid. So a tetraploid Westerwold will give you maximum yield potential. If you're looking to swap a ryegrass out for the winter cereal in the double crop option, go with an Italian that's a diploid, because it will be a little more winter hardy than a tetraploid or a Westerwold. And finally, as I'm sure many of you are already aware, ryegrasses are difficult to terminate. Oops, I thought I had another slide in there. Basically, ryegrasses have a very flexible genome. They have a very interesting metabolism, and glyphosate on its own is not going to do the job. So when you're looking to terminate a ryegrass, you're going to need a high rate of glyphosate, probably tank mixed with Altim before you go back into corn, just to make sure that that burn down happens. Temperatures need to be up 10 degrees and warming, and the plant needs to be less than a foot. So make sure that you're really following best practices for spraying off a ryegrass. And I suggest you look at sprayers101.com to really make sure that sprayer is set up for maximum coverage to burn down a ryegrass. This may be the most important slide I have for you today. In order to appropriately address this BT-resistant rootworm challenge on livestock farms, it's imperative that planning happens early and that all of the 3 advisors for that farm are involved. So I'm using nutritionist and agronomist very loosely in this slide. Whoever provides input on the crop plan and whoever provides input on the feed plan are the agronomist and nutritionist respectively. But these 3 parties, producer, nutritionist, agronomist, don't always understand why the other people are making the recommendations that they are, but they all have expert knowledge in different fields. The producer's an expert in their equipment, their labor, the past challenges on that operation. And if you get everybody on the same phone call, you have the best opportunity of coming up with a crop plan that will meet the farm's feed needs. So please get everybody involved on the same phone call so your producer is not stuck playing a bad game of a broken telephone, trying to remember and interpret what they're being told. Lastly, once we get out of that continuous corn situation, so a couple of years down the road, when we've knocked those rootworm populations back, the Canadian Corn Pest Coalition has come up with a recommendation to really improve the durability of the BT traits that we have. So first-year corn has a low rootworm injury risk. We don't want to see a rootworm BT hybrid, and we don't want to be using any of the extra crop protection products that Jocelyn mentioned in her talk. We do, however, want to scout it to find out how many adult beetles are in the crop to understand what our risk is going to be like for year 2. In the second year, it's a low to moderate risk of rootworm damage. Again, we're not using a rootworm BT trait in that crop, but if the adult beetle count from the first year was above threshold, that's when we're going to be applying those extra protections. So whether it's a soil applied insecticide or a seed treatment. In the third year, this is where we can use those BT hybrids, but we do not want any extra protections because that will speed up resistance. So year 3 of corn production is where those rootworm BT traits belong. And then the 4th year, we rotate out of corn into ideally a non-host crop or a few years of a potential alternate host. And this should help us maintain the durability and help protect our corn crop so we can continue to grow corn into the future. So with that, I'll pass things over to Dr. Elson Shields.
Well, thank you, Christine. What I want to talk about is some research we've been doing just south of the border in New York on biocontrol of corn rootworm. And so my first slide tells the entire story of my talk. If on your left over here, we have a failing BT event that came out of my 2020 New York trial. It doesn't matter which event has failed. They all look the same, but you can see rather severe damage. And on the right is the same exact failing BT event planted over our persistent nematodes that were applied in 2014. So 7 years after application of a biocontrolled nematodes or entomopathogenic nematodes, native to New York, we have excellent damage suppression. So entomopathogenic nematodes are obligate parasites of insects. Many people tend to confuse them with plant parasitic. They are only attack insects. They're naturally occurring in the soil, and they kill their host and reproduce within their cadavers. And then they stream out and search for other hosts. Now, EPNs or biocontrolled nematodes, the commercial strains are easily purchased on the web. The problem with them is they're only present in the soil from 7 to 90 days. They've lost their ability to persist. They're more virulent. They're 100% effective at application, and they're used as a biopesticide and often used in many of our high-value crops. My research for the past 30 years has been on native strains. We first isolated them in northern New York. They persist for years, so our focus was a single inoculation. They're less virulent, but they're there year after year after year. And there's only a portion of the population that's infective at any one time. This is why they can persist. So how did we stumble onto this technology? And I literally stumbled onto this technology. Well, New York is cursed or blessed with alfalfa snout beetle. This insect, this is the only place that occurs in North America. We've had a few brave individuals that have swum across the St. Lawrence River, and so now it's in the dairy areas here of eastern Ontario. Kills out alfalfa in a single year by root feeding, and you cannot control them with insecticides. So very early on, we had to come up with a new strategy, and here is a plot from the mid-1990s, and you can see that the snout beetle has killed out the alfalfa, and right up to the line where our plots with nematodes, we have preserved alfalfa. Fast forward now some 30 years, We have more than 28,000 acres inoculated with biocontrolled nematodes on more than 130 farms. You can be a snake oil salesman for a year or two, but if you have farmers that have applied this much, they must be seeing benefit. Stand life has increased 4 to 6 years, back to 4 to 6 years rather than 1 to 2. Snout beetle has disappeared, and there's an independent business, Mary DeBeer and Malone, who is now supplying nematodes for northern New York and certainly has exported some into Canada. So in the process of this research, when we were trying to answer the question, will they persist across rotation? Here is an example. They were applied in 2008. And when it was rotated to corn, you can see how the nematode population increased in first-year corn. And boom, in second-year corn, now they're almost in 100% of the soil samples. This is indirect evidence that there's activity against corn rootworm. And we saw this across many fields. We were tracking across 75 fields, and this is what we saw. So this inspired us to go and look directly on corn rootworm activity. So we initiated a trial in Central New York in 2014, where we had 3 treatments. We had no nematodes. We had a mix of Styrenium carpocapsae, Styrenium feltii, and a mix of the 2 species, feltii and Heterobidites bacteocra. Over the top, we planted 6 rows of conventional corn, 6 rows of Yield Guard Cry 3BB1, 6 rows of 3435 Herculex, and 6 rows of Smart Stack. So we had this combination of corn planted above no nematodes or either of these two nematode combination. So Christine showed you a little bit about the damage. I'm going to reiterate it. Economic loss occurs somewhere between a half and 1 node chewed off by rootworms, depending upon whether it's a dry or a wet year. So as I show you some data, think about the half to 1 node being the critical point. So here's 7 years worth of data. This is the non-traded rootworm corn. So this is conventional corn. In 2016, 2 years after we applied nematodes, we had an economic infestation. So here is 1.85 nodes gone in our no nematode plots. Plus nematodes, the damage was reduced to 2/10 of a node for an 89% reduction in damage, just with the additional mortality for the nematode. 2017, 2018, we didn't have any good pressure. 2019 in New York, we had a pretty dry year, but we had a half a node, so we're just on that edge of economic loss. You add nematodes, the nematode plots had a quarter of a node gone for a 50% suppression or reduction of damage. This is not surprising because nematodes swim on the film, the water film on soil particles, and when it gets pretty dry, they don't move around as well. We had some cages in the field that's very dry that year, and in those cages, we had 2 nodes gone with no nematodes. Where the nematodes were present, it was 1.6. This is still economic loss for a 24% damage reduction. So under very droughty soils, nematodes will not provide as good a control, but then we have other yield issues when we get that dry. In 2020, this past year, we had 6/10 of a node gone. It's just slightly in the economic range. You add the nematode plots, it's 0.1, 86% damage reduction. So that looks pretty good. Now, if you look in one of our 34-35 traded corn, which I have a resistant population, it shows some very interesting data. So 2016, there was no advantage to having nematodes in your plots. There's the same amount of damage. 2017, we didn't have pressure. 2018, here this traded corn already had over a half a node damage. You add, in the nematode plots, you saw an 86% reduction of damage. So there was an additional benefit. In 2019, in this resistant population, you now had a one node gone, certainly an economic loss. In the nematode plots, you saw non-economic at 82% reduction. In those extremely dry soils, here's two nodes gone, reduced it to barely an economic loss for 63%. And in 2020, you had 8/10 without nematodes, 2/10 where the nematodes were present, and the drier soils, you saw similar results. So in summary, established biocontrol nematodes provided a 50 to 90% reduction in rootworm feeding damage 2 to 6 years after a single application or inoculation. Dry soil conditions during rootworm larval period can reduce biocontrol nematodes' efficacy, and biocontrol nematodes are completely compatible with rootworm BT technology. So why can we say that they persist in continuous corn? Well, I'll show you one graph. You can see here, so the nematodes were applied in 2014. Here's 2016, the big year that the first results I showed you, and here is 2020. The two bars are the solid line is conventional corn, where we often see 18 adults per square foot emerge, and smart stack, where we're down to about 1 adult emerge. And you can see that the levels of nematodes in both those plots track each other really well, to where you're talking about 30 to 40% of the soil samples are positive for nematodes. So 7 years after they were applied, we still have very high level of biocontrol nematodes in the plots. We've done some work about persistence around the country. We've shown persistence from a single application for more than 20 years in northern New York. This is not surprising. We first isolated them in northern New York, 6 years in Vermont, 4 years in Missouri and northwest Texas, up in Dalhart, 3 years in East Lansing, Michigan, which is not too far from Ontario there with Chris DeFonso, 2 years in Pennsylvania, southeast New Mexico, and Roswell, Alabama. And this last year, we put out plots in Iowa, western Nebraska, and North Carolina, because we believe if we can show persistence, we can show efficacy and activity. So where do they fit? Can they be used standalone in conventional corn? No. If we use them alone, we would get rootworm resistance to nematodes, just like we have to BT and our other management tools. They're completely compatible with our rootworm technology to kill off the toxin survivors. They're an independent mortality factor, so we should use them with our other technology. And under some conditions, we actually see a 50% reduction of adult emergence, so it may be a mitigation tool. So how do we apply? They're easy to apply. Here's a standard large sprayer. You remove the screens and filters. You change the nozzles to a stream nozzle. You crank the application rate to 50 gallons per acre. You apply late in the day because they are UV sensitive. And we've had more than 30,000 acres in New York inoculated with this technology. So we understand it well. It's very effective, requires just a minimum of modification. My colleague Mike Hunter in northern New York for years thought we could apply them in liquid dairy manure. He finally convinced me that that was a possibility after he convinced me that they didn't just want me to stand behind one of those tanks and hit the switch. And we found out that if you add nematodes to the manure and have it on the field in less than 30 minutes, we get no mortality. So, I mean, it's amazing to me that these nematodes would survive in liquid dairy manure right out of the pit. But apparently it's oxygen deprivation. They can hold their breath for 30 minutes. And if you get them out onto the ground, they're fine. The manure provides us with a UV block with the particles in it, lots of water. And so therefore you can apply them any time of the day, and it saves the farmer a trip over the field. So what do these nematodes cost? $50 an acre? for the nematodes, plus shipping cost, plus application cost. And remember, this is a one-time cost. These strains of biocontrol nematodes persist for many years. And in fields we followed, we got tired of looking for them after 10 years. If you look at this as a cost depreciated over 5 years, we're looking at $10 a year. If we're talking $4 corn, that's 2.5 bushels or 1.5% yield loss based on 180 bushels. Now, as Christine mentioned, 1 node of roots that you lose is 15% yield loss in that neighborhood. We do not detect up to a 5% yield loss unless you're out there digging roots. So 5% yield loss is 9 bushels. It's $36 an acre of yield that you can protect. You pay for the cost of application in 2 years. Where can you get them? Mary DeBeer has been providing these nematodes for New York farmers for 6 years. We fill in and help her when she gets behind. There's no import permit required to bring them in from the US. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jocelyn.
So just to wrap it up and kind of review where we think we need to go with rootworm management, whether you've got BT resistant problems or not in Ontario, we've put together these recommendations here. Basically, the risk of corn rootworm in first year corn is negligible to nothing. Therefore, BT corn for rootworm is not required. Plant a non-BT or above ground BT hybrid only to have protection from corn borer and western green cutworm. Scout that crop late in the season to see if there are significant numbers of rootworm beetles in the field. If there's more than 1 per plant and you're growing corn next year, then you want to think about control. But again, a rootworm BT hybrid would not be necessary. You should have low to moderate populations. So using a high rate neonic seed treatment or a soil insecticide should be effective enough. But again, monitor those beetle populations late in the summer. And in third year corn, you might then start to use the BT rootworm hybrids that have a pyramid of rootworm proteins in them without any other insecticide protection. Don't plant these BT rootworm hybrids for more than 2 years in a row, and ideally rotate out of corn in year 4 to wipe out the rootworm populations in that field. In addition, as we've learned from Elson, we might want to consider establishing populations of biocontrolled nematodes if you're looking at continuous corn production in the future. We hope to start some research on that in Ontario next year, and so if you're interested in that, you can contact any of the speakers here on the panel today, and we can talk about that. And lastly, let's keep a better eye on corn rootworm populations in the coming years in Ontario. And if you encounter any unexpected injury or significant beetle populations, please let your seed sales representative, your MAFRA specialist, or the Canadian Corn Pest Coalition know about that. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Jocelyn, Christine, and Elson. That was amazing. Just a couple of questions that we seem to get on occasion. First, Jocelyn, if a grower hasn't heard of any resistant issues popping up in their area, are they safe to continue practices as usual, continuous corn and going with BT corn rootworm hybrids?
I would say that they should really look at their crop rotation in a serious way and consider those recommendations that I just reviewed at the end of the presentation. We think this, it's difficult to get away from rootworm hybrids right now because there are so many pyramided products on the market, but the risk of resistance is definitely there, and we don't want to be putting that selection pressure against populations where it's not necessary.
Great.
And can I add a thought to that too?
Absolutely.
Just the reminder, and it sounds obvious, but like, this is a bug, it flies. This spreads very differently than herbicide resistant weeds. So because it's a landscape approach, even if you think you don't have a problem or your neighborhood doesn't have a problem, you don't know that until your corn crop gets wiped out. So don't take the risk. Just switching into that more responsible production management is gonna probably save you a lot of pain in the long run.
Great advice. Awesome. And Elson, I had a question about nematodes. I noticed you mentioned that the manure provides a UV block. So are there concerns if they go with the sprayer application on bare ground? Are there specific conditions that those nematodes need to be put in?
If the sprayer application is put on after dinner time, say in the early evening, the nematodes have all evening to get into the soil profile, and we don't have deaths from UV light. The other option, the reason we asked to use fertilizer stream nozzles is it puts down a rather concentrated stream of water that's separated by, roughly 24 inches of the nozzle spacing, and that allows a wetting even under dry conditions. And then with the evening hours, we get perfect establishment. If in contrast, the applicator decides to apply them at 10 o'clock in the morning on bare soil, we get a lot of mortality. So the sprayer application needs to happen after, say, 5 or 6 p.m. And the second recommendation is you don't mix the nematodes in the spray tank and then go eat dinner. You actually need to get them right out on the field within an hour, because you have such a high concentration of nematodes in the spray water, they will start to suffocate if you don't agitate and get them on the field.
Any issues with soil temperatures? Do they have to be put on at a certain temperature?
We recommend that the soil temperature needs to be at least 10 C or 50 Fahrenheit, but we've not tested that. We know they're active all the way down to about 6 C in the springtime. So we think that they could probably tolerate colder, but just farmers tend to push conditions. And so we have set the boundaries of 10 C.
My final question, and again, to Jocelyn, how did this issue come about, and how do we get out of this issue? And is it everyone's problem, or just the areas in Perth and Huron and the few fields in Durham that we know of?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm afraid I think it's anybody's problem who grows continuous corn. And, we've been using these traits for a long time already, and we've probably been overusing them where they aren't necessary. And as you can see in the US, it's become a really widespread issue. And so we have an opportunity here to probably tackle it before it gets really bad in Ontario. And I think that this is why we're getting the message out, because we're starting to see big issues in certain pockets, and we don't want this to become a widespread thing. We still can use these traits in lots of areas, but we need to start to think about this in a more long-term approach. Maybe we need to start looking at multiple tactics, like including the nematodes, and just rotating away from the BT traits, as our only means of controlling rootworms.
Great. Thanks again to all our speakers and their content.
Okay, that is the end of day one. I'm going to put up the CCA barcode for anyone who is collecting CCA points today. So I will leave that up for a second. And while people are getting their CCA points, we'd just like to thank you to our sponsor for today, Syngenta Canada. It's nice to have partners that work with us throughout the season and allow us to put on these presentations. So tomorrow we're back again at 1:30, starting with a session with Decal Canada, and then moving into Miravis ACE with Eric Richter. And then we have Wheat Pete joining us for management strategies on grain corn. Thank you everyone who joined us today. And if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch with anyone from the Agrimart, or we might have some time tomorrow morning or tomorrow afternoon to address them. Thanks again. See you tomorrow.